Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you. And again, this is week number 2. Our great thanks to AJ Levine for being with us last week and the wonderful presentation on John 1 and the prologue. We're looking forward today to doing the wedding of Cana. It's our great honor to have her here with us. And it's been such an excitement to do, just to have personally just a moment to chat with her. It's been wonderful. If you would, I'm going to like to ask you all to start with just a moment of silent prayer. Awful lot going on in the world and even in this part of the world. And so if we'll start with a little silence, and then I'll get a prayer and turn it over. Let's pray together. Father, for the many things that you give us, we give thanks. We ask that you hold us in the hollow of your hand, that you be with us in all places and all times. You continue to be our guiding spirit and our light. We ask that you be with us and bring to our minds the presence that you always are. We give thanks for AJ and her many gifts, and we ask you to open our hearts and our minds and our ears to absorb and to live out the word. In Christ's name, amen. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Good. It's again a pleasure to be back and to see new friends as well as some old friends. It's a delight to be with you. Last week we talked about John chapter 1, specifically focusing on the prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We talked to some extent about how John echoes what the church calls the Old Testament, what the synagogue calls the Tanakh. So if we begin in the beginning, then that sends us back to the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which begins in the beginning when God began to create the heavens and the earth. So what John tells us right in the first couple of verses is, I'm going to echo parts of the Old Testament, which is, by the way, the only Bible people in the church had, because the New Testament hadn't been written yet. So it doesn't mean they have to look up lots of stuff. So what John is signaling in chapter 1 is go back and look at your own scripture. And the Old Testament is the scripture of both the Jews who are followers of Jesus and the Gentiles, the non-Jews who are followers of Jesus. And John expects that everybody is going to be familiar with that text. And if you're not, John is saying, go get familiar with that text. Because the more you know about, and again, I'm going to use the term Old Testament, the more you know about the Old Testament, the richer John becomes. So John is saying, reread the Old Testament, but now through the eyes of resurrection, now through the eyes of the church, and reread my gospel, reread John's gospel through that Old Testament. And in that relationship, in that juxtaposition, we begin to see new things. So as we noticed last week, in the beginning sends us back to in the beginning. We saw how the word in the beginning was the word. The word in Aramaic, memra, is a circumlocution for the name of God. So Jews, instead of saying God did this and God did this, would sometimes say the word did this or the word did that. So we sometimes today use circumlocutions as well. So instead of talking about God, we might say heaven, right? Heaven bless you, or good heavens, which is another way of saying good God. So we use circumlocutions. So for Jews, word was a circumlocution for God. So if you said in the beginning was the word, Aramaic speaking Jews are going to go, well, yeah. And the word was with God? Well, yeah, because God creates by the word. And the word was God? Sure, because it's a circumlocution for God. And we saw how that word among Stoics, among Greek philosophers, the word, the logos in Greek, was that world principle. The word is what creates order out of chaos. So John at the beginning says, I'm speaking to Jews, I'm speaking to Greek philosophers, I'm speaking to people who have read the Old Testament. And then we have this nice philosophical survey. We have a little bit in John chapter 1 about John the Baptist. Remember John the Baptist? All right. There is, by the way, no baptism of Jesus in the Gospel of John. There's a John who's baptizing and he knows, but there's no baptism. Why? Probably because by the time we get toward the end of the first century, John the Baptist had his own followers. If you know the book of Acts, Presbyterians, if you know the book of Acts, there's a fellow named Apollos, and he meets up with Paul and Prisca and Aquila. And Apollos only knows the baptism of John, doesn't know about the Holy Spirit, that other stuff. So they have to teach him. John the Baptist had his own followers. John the Baptist to this day has his own followers. It's one of those minority religions we find, particularly in Iran, where things are not very good for them. They're called Mandeans. There's also a group of Mandeans in New York, by the way, they emigrated. They think John the Baptist is the Messiah and Jesus is some sort of upstart. So what happens by the end of the first century, the author of the Gospel of John knows about these John the Baptist people, and he wants to make it very clear that Jesus is more important than John. How do you do that? John the Baptist didn't even baptize Jesus. He didn't need to be baptized. You might have thought you heard that. Probably didn't happen. So it's a different way of understanding John the Baptist. In chapter 1, John the Baptist gets asked, "Are you Elijah?" No. Would have thought so from the synoptics. "Are you a prophet?" No. "Who are you?" "I'm the one who's come to proclaim the Messiah, and that's my only role." With me so far? That's chapter 1. Let's move on to chapter 2. We have a wedding. Ideally, I could turn the church coffee into wine, or for those of you who prefer, grape juice. I'm good. I don't have that particular talent. But the question is, so why start with a wedding, right? I mean, if the first sign, and we'll talk about signs in the Gospel of John, if the first sign had been raising Lazarus, I mean, boy, people would have paid attention to that. That's pretty good. But why at a wedding, which is, it's for the village, but it's not for the village next door? And why turn water into wine? Why not walk on water or raise the dead or heal somebody? So we'll talk about why beginning here, just as a couple of things to think about before we get into this material. And I'm going to go verse by verse. It's only 11 verses, so we can get this done. As I mentioned, John consistently echoes the Old Testament. So why wine? Well, the first wine that we have in the Bible is Genesis chapter 9. It's the story of Noah. What does Noah do when he gets, well, first he makes a sacrifice. He's probably happy, get on dry land. What does he do? He plants a vineyard, which I think is optimistic. Okay, he gets drunk and things go kind of downhill. But it is a sense of, wine is a divine gift, but use it carefully, use it cautiously, don't over drink. So even with that wine, John is sending us back to the time of Noah. But Noah in the first century would have reminded Jesus followers of baptism. And you can see that in 1 Peter. We also have a sense of a wedding. So if Genesis chapter 1 is in the beginning was the word, Genesis chapter 2 is Adam and Eve. And that's a kind of wedding of sorts where a man leaves his father and his mother and cleaves to his wife and they become one flesh. So maybe Genesis chapter 2 is undergirding the story of the wedding at Cana. John is saying, every time I give you an example, go back to the Old Testament and you might find something new. Final note on this, we don't know if all this John intended. And all I can do is say to John, gee, I see a connection here between your wedding at Cana and Genesis chapter 2. Did you intend that? And when John and I chat, and John's usual comment to me is, I can see where you get it. How much is there and how much of it is our imagination? I think John wanted us to use our imagination, see even more. Okay, so here's the beginning. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee. And just go, fine. I'm curious on what happened on the first day and the second day. Right. And I think John wants us to go back and say, oh, now I have to go back and reread chapter 1 to figure out what was going on. And why do I care about Cana and Galilee? Because it's just a tiny village and not much happens. And what's Galilee? So on the third day, John is really interested in telling time. And when we look at the Gospel of John, Jesus will frequently say, and he starts this in this chapter 2, my hour has not yet come. The hour is coming and now is on the third day, which should have third day resurrection. So what John is doing right at the beginning is saying, pay attention to time and moving us from a sense of clock time. I'm very conscious of clock time. I know that at 10:45, I'm done. And I know that before that, people who have these robes on are going to get up and go because they got choir stuff, right? So we're always looking at our watch to figure out, John is saying, stop thinking about clock time and start thinking about every moment as divine, every moment as special, every hour as being something new. So let's talk about what happened on days 1 and 2, because people don't look at this. Well, first of all, on the third day, if you go back to the Old Testament and you look up references to on the third day, the first time we get it is in Genesis chapter 22. This is set on the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the mountain of the Lord. This is Mount Zion, where eventually the Jerusalem temple will be built. If you've ever been to the land of Israel and you've been to the Kotel, the Western Wall, that's that mountain. On the third day, Abraham expects that he's going to sacrifice his son. So as soon as I have a reference to on the third day, I'm going to have a sense of the crucifixion, because the early followers of Jesus looked at the near sacrifice of Isaac, the sacrifice that didn't happen. Isaac, Abraham's only son who was left because Ishmael was expelled in the previous chapter. That almost sacrifice of Isaac becomes a prediction of the sacrifice of Jesus. So on the third day, sacrifice. John hasn't told me Jesus is going to get killed yet. But I think, as I mentioned last week, the author of the Gospel of John knows Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And John is not writing this to people who know nothing. John is writing primarily to people who are already in the Christian system, who are already followers of Jesus. And John is saying, on the third day, pay attention, people. I'm already predicting the crucifixion and the resurrection. It was on the third day that God manifested God's self on Mount Sinai and gave the Torah to Moses. On the third day, the prophet Hosea exhorts the people Israel to return to the Lord. That's what prophets generally do. Prophets are out there to tell us we're not doing what we're supposed to do. They're very annoying. They're usually right, and nobody wants to listen to them. By the way, the only successful prophet in the Old Testament is Jonah, and that's clearly fictional, right? So prophets are out there saying, get back with the program, get back with the program. It's kind of like a weekly revival. They're very annoying. So Hosea exhorts the people, return to the Lord. The Hebrew term for Lord here is YHWH, that unpronounceable name of God. But the word comes into Greek as kurios, as in Kyrie eleison. And that's the term that's used for Jesus, like Lord Jesus. So when Christians hear return to the Lord, they're hearing return to Jesus. After 2 days, he will revive us or bring us to life. And on the third day, he will raise us up so that we may live before him. So if you read the prophet Hosea with resurrection eyes, on the third day is a sign of resurrection. You can't miss it. So here we have Jesus as the new Isaac and Jesus being raised up on the third day. So as soon as John tells me on the third day, before I even get to the wedding, I'm going, oh, I have to go back to Abraham. I have to go back to Hosea. Here's the third day. John never tells us that the resurrection is on the third day, but we find it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as well as in Acts and in 1 Corinthians. So John is assuming everybody knows that third day reference. Comments or questions so far? So somebody says, I'll meet you 3 days from now. There might be more going on there. What happened on the first and the second day? Well, here's the second day. I'm back in John chapter 1 with the story of John the Baptist. John 1:29, this is most English translations, read the next day. What the Greek actually says is tomorrow. John saw Jesus coming toward him and declared, here is the Lamb of God who takes away, literally it's takes up, lifts up the sin of the world. So what happened on day 2? The proclamation of Jesus is the one who will take away sin. And how does Jesus take away sin? Through the cross and through the resurrection. If you get to the end of the gospel and you see the cross, then you go back to John chapter 1 and say, oh, that's what he was talking about. What happened on day 1? The story of John the Baptist. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light. What's the light? Jesus is, as we saw last week, the light of the world. John is really, really tightly written. But unless we go back and read it again, read chapter 1 in light of chapter 2, read the entire gospel in light of the end of the gospel, what does John testify? He was not the light. Hello, followers of John the Baptist, you're missing. He's not the light. He came to testify to the light. So here's day 3. Here's a wedding. So if you go to church history on this wedding, by the way, church history loves this wedding. By the time we get up to the 4th and 5th century, who were the bride and groom? Because we never meet them. All right. I want to know who they were. I want to know what wedding patterns they registered for. You know, did they pick up sterling? Was it a good pattern? Right. Who gave them the big platter? So the early church legend cast the bride as Mary Magdalene and the groom is the author of the Gospel of John. Right. So by the time you get up to the Middle Ages, It was in the 5th century where Mary Magdalene gets tagged as being a prostitute from Pope Gregory. There's nothing in the text that suggests she's a prostitute, by the way. But when you get up into the Middle Ages, well, how did she become a prostitute? She must have been left at the altar. So you have this entire backstory of Mary Magdalene that has nothing to do with history. And who's the groom? The groom is the author of the Gospel of John. How was he there? Because he knew what happened at the wedding. So he had to be there to witness. It's all legend. There's nothing in the Gospel of John to suggest this. But it's kind of helpful to think, well, if we go back, we never meet the bride. She's not there. We never meet the groom. He's not there. Maybe the most important people at the wedding might, in fact, not be bridezilla and groomzilla, but in fact, the wedding guests. Pay attention to others who show up at the wedding. I just think that's helpful. Why wedding? Why start with this idea of a wedding? Why is this the first sign? So I can't prove this, but here's what I think is going on. If we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul is writing before any of the Gospels, Paul wrote first, then the Gospels, we might get a sense, if we read closely and we were concerned about things like gender and sex, which of course nobody today is concerned about. Think about gender and sex. We might get the sense that Jesus was promoting celibacy. Why? 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Well, if they're talking about virgins, if they're not practicing self-control, they should marry because it's better to marry than to burn with passion. That's not a real strong endorsement of the marital bond, right? You know, if you can't keep it in your toga, get married. But for Paul, better stay single because then you can focus on the coming of Jesus and you can focus on faith and you don't have to worry about, you know, who's catering the wedding. So from Paul, who says, I wish all as I were, you might get the idea that being celibate is the better way to go. If we read the Gospels, Mark talks about the time when we will be like the angels of heaven who are neither married nor given in marriage. Doesn't sound pro-marriage. Matthew, who talks about eunuchs. I'm not going to define this formally, but back then, when they talked about people being eunuchized, you could remove any part of the package. I hope that's clear. Okay. There were eunuchs who had been so from birth, and there were eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others because people did that back then. And there were people who eunuchized themselves because people actually did that. You know, so praised are those who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Now, I don't think Jesus is saying take out a scalpel and go whack. But what generally this was interpreted to be is give up the privilege of becoming a father, because the one things eunuchs could not do was father children. Well, if you're not going to father children, why bother to get married in the 1st century? Luke, whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother and wife. So by the time you read all this stuff, you might get the impression that these early followers of Jesus are celibate. Everybody with me so far? John is saying, get married. It's fine. Jesus will cater. Don't take the wrong view. If you want to get married, it's terrific. I think John may start with this sign in part because people were worried, can I get married? Can I not get married? And John is saying, absolutely get married. Have a good time. Cater. Comments or questions so far? Endorsement. Absolutely. I mean, I don't think John was a wedding planner. But I do think this is resolving a question that people who read Matthew, Mark, and Luke might have had. In the same way, and we talked about this briefly last week, if we just read the Gospel of Luke, we would think that Mary and Martha didn't talk to each other because they never talk to each other in Luke. In John, they are best friends. And they talk to each other all the time. So John is taking care of certain loose ends in the synoptics and tying them together. Now, this also could have started with a wedding because the first sign Jesus did was turn water into wine at Cana. That could have been just the way it happened historically, but I think there's more going on there. Moreover, why start with the wedding? Because throughout the New Testament tradition, the gospel tradition, Jesus is typically identified as a bridegroom, and his buddies, his disciples, are, most English translations say wedding guests, but what the Greek actually says is sons of the wedding hall. So it's not men and women here, it's the groom's attendants. So Jesus is the bridegroom, The disciples are the groom's attendants, which means if you are at the presence of Jesus, you are at a wedding. There should be joy, there should be celebration. And weddings in antiquity as well as today, what are they marked by? Food, which is in part why Jesus keeps meeting people at table. It's not just for that eschatological banquet, this wonderful banquet where there's plenty of wine. We'll get to that. Jews in the first century envisioned heaven as a kind of giant banquet where you feasted with God. So that's why Jesus keeps meeting people at table. But it's also because to be with Jesus is to be in the presence of the bridegroom. And what do you do at a wedding? You feast. What also happens at weddings? Families that are not united become united. So what weddings do is they bring families together. They bring people together. And just to prove it, here are some examples that I've given you about how Jesus is identified as a bridegroom. We can find this in Matthew 9, Mark 2, Luke 5. And there are lots of parables, by the way, about weddings. In Matthew chapter 25, Matthew 25 is usually known as the chapter where you have the parable of the sheep and the goats. Is that familiar? That should be familiar to you, right? If there's heaven and there's a line and there's a sheep line and a goat line, get into the sheep line, don't ask any questions, you're good to go. But before that, there's a parable of wise and foolish virgins, and they're waiting for the bridegroom who has been delayed. And that's the sense of Jesus who's in heaven, but he's supposed to come back, but there's a delay. And Matthew says, just keep going, keep your light burning and all that. And if you fall asleep, it's okay, as long as you got some light left. This is Jesus as the delayed bridegroom. So there are concerns about the bridegroom all the way through. And John just wants to make sure that we've had this. So following the wedding at Cana, we get another brief appearance of John the Baptist. And what does John say, speaking symbolically? The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. What's the bride? The bride is the church here. And the word for church, which John never uses, by the way, in the Gospels, the word church only shows up in Matthew. But the word church in Greek is ekklesia. It's where we get words like ecclesiastical or Ecclesiastes. It's a feminine noun. So who is the bridegroom? Jesus. Who is the bride? The church, which means everybody in the church is in part the bride of Christ. What that does to men in the church, you can worry about on your own. It's a little bit of gender bending, but just bear with it. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom, and his friend, the Greek term here for friend is philos, like Philadelphia, friend. Friend of the bridegroom, the one who stands and hears him, rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. So this is John the Baptist speaking about himself. But what the Gospel of John is doing is saying, if you are a friend of the bridegroom, which is everybody in the church, then you rejoice when you hear the voice of the bridegroom. So when I have a story about a wedding, and I've got all this stuff in Matthew, Mark, and Luke about Jesus as a bridegroom, and I've got chapter 3 where Jesus is a bridegroom, I have to go back to the wedding at Cana. Jesus isn't the bridegroom. He got invited to the wedding, but he's present there as well, which also says, by the way, that in every wedding that's a Christian wedding, the presence of Jesus should be acknowledged. With me on that one? It also takes away the bridezilla. Here's the idea that we've just mentioned is Jesus is the groom and the church is the bride. Why? Because people reading the Old Testament would have known that, because in the Old Testament, particularly in the prophets, God is the husband and Israel is the wife. Sometimes Israel strays a little bit, we get into trouble, there's some problems, but there's invariably a reconciliation. Paul picks up this idea as well. This is 2 Corinthians, where Paul says to the church, remember, church in Greek is ekklesia, it's feminine. I promised you all, you members of the congregation, in marriage to one husband, to present you as a chaste virgin to the Christ. So people reading the Gospel of John know, oh, we're the bride. And by the time we get up to the book of Revelation, John says, who wrote, not the same John as who wrote the Gospel, I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down from heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And the husband is Jesus here as the slain lamb. Everybody with me on this? If you read the New Testament and you read it closely, there's wedding image shot all the way through. Most people miss it, but it's there and it's worth picking up. Connections of John 2 to John 1. Okay, if you were with me last week, you will remember that in the beginning is an arche. Arche is in the beginning like archaeology, or archbishop, prime bishop, first bishop. So arche is first or prime. From the beginning, arche of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his woman. The Greek term is woman, is gyne, like gynecology. Woman can also mean wife, same word. And the two shall become one flesh. And the word for flesh in Greek is sarx. And it really means flesh, not just body. Body is soma. Flesh is like hair follicles and sweat glands and intestines. I mean, it's what makes us human. So the male and female become one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. But if I go back to the Gospel of John, the prologue, what happens? And the word became flesh, sarx. That very flesh in which man and women are marked, our bodies, all of it, that's what Jesus becomes. So here's another connection. Man and woman being joined together. Now I've got a wedding. They become one flesh. Let's go back to the beginning and we find flesh. The wedding in John finally was, and I'm only in verse 1, by the way, of chapter 2. That's what happens when you talk to Bible scholars. The wedding in chapter 2 anticipates more. So as I said, you can read chapter 2, go back to chapter 1, you'll see more. Read chapter 2, it anticipates stuff going on. So in John chapter 4, and I wish we had time, I wish I had another week with you because we could do John 4. This is Jesus and the lady at the well. Do we remember her? They are flirting, by the way. When she says to him, he says, give me something to drink. He says to her, give me something to drink. She says, you don't have a bucket and the well is really deep. And he says, I got living water flowing up. This is actually flirtation language. I can prove that to you, but we don't have time. And even if you didn't take my word for it on that, if you go back to the Old Testament, people frequently meet their wives at wells. Right? Abraham's servant Rebecca, Jacob and Rachel, Moses and Zipporah. So as soon as I have a man meeting a woman at a well, I'm assuming there's going to be a marriage. And by the way, they talk about marriage when Jesus says to the woman, go call your husband. She says, I don't have a husband. He said, well, yeah, you've had 5 and the guy you're living with now is not your husband. They're talking, they don't get married, but wedding at Cana, marriage in chapter 4. And when I get up to John chapter 20, as we mentioned last week, when Mary Magdalene is at the tomb and the tomb is empty and she thinks somebody has stolen the body and she sees somebody in the distance, she thinks it's the gardener. And she says, tell me where you've placed the body and I will go and claim it. This is the Hellenistic romance. And people would have known the convention. Lovers who were separated, it's Romeo and Juliet only, it works out well. One thinks the other one is dead. There's a case of mistaken identity. And then the lovers reunite. The wedding at Cana sets me up for that as well, because it's another romance story that turns out to be a different type of romance, not the romance between two people who are in love with each other, but the romance between Jesus and his followers, the romance between the God of Israel and the church, and so on. So John chapter 2, as soon as I hear about a wedding, all of this stuff is to be anticipated. And I read chapter 4 and I read chapter 20 and I go back to chapter 2 and I find more. Comments or questions so far? You're all okay? It gets better. Here's weddings and new families where a man leaves his father and mother and cleaves to his wife. And what does John do? Create new families. How? Because when I get to John chapter 3, which is the story of Nicodemus, you have to be born anew or to be born from above. That's creating a new family where you're all specifically new children of God. And the mother of Jesus was there because we have to get back to John chapter 2. I'm still in the first verse. Okay. The mother of Jesus in the Gospel of John is never called Mary. She's always called the mother of Jesus. Well, we know her name is Mary because we've read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So why call her the mother of Jesus? Well, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, John very much stresses the fatherhood of God. You can only see the Father through the Son. No one knows the Father but to the Son. But the Son, the only way to the Father is through the Son. So John specifically, more than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, uses father language for God, mother language for Mary. And it might be father language, the divine part, mother language, the human part. So as long as John continues to call Mary the mother of Jesus, that anchors him into humanity. It's both parents. That's part of the relation to the word in the first part. She's the mother of Jesus, but she also becomes, in John 19, the new mother of the unnamed beloved disciple. So John 19 is the crucifixion, where Jesus sees his mother and the beloved disciple, also never named, by the way. standing at the cross, and he says to the beloved disciple, behold your mother, and he says to the mother, behold your son. The relationship is what's important, not the personal name, but the relationship. And because she's always called the mother of Jesus, we begin to forget that Jesus has other brothers and sisters. But what Jesus does is entrust his mother to the beloved disciple. For the Gospel of John, for the early Christian church, what was most important was not your natal family, the womb out of which you sprang, the sperm that helped conceive you. What was really important is that you were born anew into this new family of faith. That doesn't mean you had to leave your parents behind, but it meant that this new loyalty, which was most important to you. Here's the focus on her maternal role. And in this sense, she's everyone's new mother. And because she doesn't have a name, Jesus actually has to call her something. He doesn't call her mom. I think that would have been great if he called her mommy. I mean, there's a word for that. He doesn't use it. He calls her woman, as we'll see. If my son looked at me and said, woman, why are you calling me? There would be a chat. Yeah. It's not a great term. We'll get there. So Jesus and his disciples were called to the wedding. So the Greek term is actually kaleo, like you would be called to be a disciple. So you're called to the wedding, it's inviting. And I like this idea because it raises the question about who do you invite to weddings and who should be there. I wonder if Jesus and the disciples were an afterthought. Oh, and they were, the mother of Jesus was there and they were called. There's no mention of Joseph. And there's no mention of his brothers and sisters. So I don't know what the relationship is between the bride and the groom, or even what side Jesus would be on. And I don't know how many disciples there were. I do wonder, because if he's got 20, no wonder they ran out of wine, right? Who gets invited? Who gets to tag along? Back then, by the way, in the later rabbinic system, we talked a little bit about the rabbis last week. If you were a rabbi, your disciples were male, by the way, your disciples were considered your sons. So if the rabbi went somewhere, the disciples came along. If you had 100 disciples, this is going to be a lot. No mention of the 12 until chapter 6. So I don't know how many. And when the wine was lacking, the mother of Jesus says to him, they have no wine. Okay. This is what people in antiquity call, well, we still do, an indirect request. Right. So Jesus will say to the Samaritan woman, give me to drink, like give me some wine. Similarly, Jesus will say on the cross, I thirst. Now there's a difference here. So if somebody says they have no wine, this is not simply a matter of information. They have no wine, good to know. So to go back to my son, if I say to Alexander, my son, some of you may know Alex, I used to bring him here years ago when I didn't have somebody to take care of him on Sunday morning. So Alex knows more about the New Testament than most little Jewish kids. If I say to Alexander, who's now 34, next week is your sister's birthday, I am not simply conveying information. I am hinting, send a card, make a call, right? If my husband says to me, we have no milk, nice to know, right? Or if I say to him, the dog wants to go out, right? So this is what is called an indirect request. I could say, please take the dog out. Or he could say, please go shopping, right? So you make an indirect request, which is kind of a polite way of saying something. And if you get ignored, well, you didn't actually ask. And people would do that back then. We have a really good example of another indirect request in John chapter 11, which is the raising of Lazarus, where Mary and Martha send word to Jesus, Lazarus, whom you love, is ill. Do something. So you might pay attention to these indirect requests. And here's the example from John 11. Sometimes Jesus makes a direct request, give me something to drink. And you can't refuse that. An indirect request you can. And here, John 19:28, where Jesus says on the cross, I thirst. Okay. What is this doing? It's not only giving you examples of direct and indirect request, it's also making other connections. When the mother of Jesus says they don't have any wine, now I'm thinking about people who are thirsty and where there's wine and who gets wine. So as soon as there's no wine at Cana, when I get to Jesus in chapter 4, when he says, I thirst, he can provide wine if he wanted. He could just make wine appear miraculously. But when he says, I thirst, he's bringing that Samaritan woman in, give me to drink. And when he says, I thirst, as he's dying, it sends me back to John chapter 2, where there was plenty of wine to go around. Or I'm thirsty to the woman. When he says, I thirst, it means he wants to be in relationship with us. It's not just that he's thirsty. It's all this other stuff. What is John doing? We've already seen in John chapter 1 the idea of creating order out of chaos. So you create by the word and you say, let there be light. That's order out of chaos. In John chapter 2, it's another example of creating order out of chaos. They ran out of wine at the wedding. That's chaotic. Now, it might not seem chaos like the beginning of creation before the Big Bang, but if you're the bride or you're the groom, this is a disaster, right? What is John doing in chapter 2? Jesus is creating order out of chaos. We have a social disaster, not to worry. Universal and very, very personal. Images of drinking. They've run out of wine. Well, whoever would drink the water that I will give them will never thirst. Well, what's that water? That's the water that gets turned into wine, that gets turned into Jesus' blood, that gives us eternal life. It's all there, except until we get to the end of the Gospel of John, we would not know that. John in the Last Supper does not have a Eucharist. Eucharist, communion, water, body and blood. That's reserved back in chapter 6, after the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus says, unless you eat the flesh, that's that Sark's language, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man, the Son of humanity, and drink his blood, you will have no life in you. Back to chapter 2. They've run out of wine, but wine is also blood, is also Jesus' blood, right? And Jesus in chapter 18, this is toward the end of the gospel, Jesus says to Peter, the cup that the Father gave me, shall I not drink of it? It's more drinking language, thirsting language, encoded all the way through. Everybody with me so far? At this point, you should be thirsty. Right? I'm quite serious. So that when you get to the end of the Gospel of John, you should be thirsty because you've had all these images of thirst, 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 wine, 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 water, 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 drink, drink, drink. So by the time you get to the end of the Gospel of John, you should be thirsty in both ways. Your throat should be parched. But then John says, as soon as you take a sip of water, as soon as you take a sip of wine, that taste is going to remind you of everything back in the gospel. And that's John's concern for our senses. Jesus says to her, what to me and to you, woman? Which is basically saying, what business is that of either yours or mine, or not my problem, or colloquially, butt out. It's not my concern. They ran out of wine. It's not your concern. You're not the bride. You're not the groom. You're just a guest. And it's not my concern. It's none of our business. This is actually an idiom in Greek. What to you and to me. And then you can add on something. Frequently said in the Matthew, Mark, and Luke by demons, right? So in Mark chapter 7, this is like the demon whose name is Legion. This is a story where the pigs go over the cliff. We remember this one? 20 verses in Mark 5. The demons cry out, what to me and to you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I implore you by God, do not torture me. In other words, I'm a demon. You're the son of, stay in your own lane. You do the Son of God stuff. I'll do the demon stuff. You don't have anything to do with me and I don't have anything to do with you. And Jesus says, well, as a matter of fact, I do have something to do with you. Go away. Similarly, in Mark chapter 1, exactly the same expression, except here it's us. What to us and to you, Jesus of Nazareth, this is a demon speaking, have you come to destroy us? Well, yeah. So the demons say, stay in your own lane. Jesus says, what to me and to you? Nothing to do with this. It's not our problem. Jesus says it actually is. So in Mark, it's demons who say, what to me and to you? In the Gospel of John, it's Jesus talking to his mother, what to me and to you? And in case you don't believe me that this is a standard expression, you can find it in the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. Okay, so the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, except for a couple verses in Ezra, Nehemiah, and Daniel that are written in Aramaic. It had to be translated into Greek because in the 3rd century, the 200s BCE, there were Jews living in Alexandria in Egypt and in Athens and in places west who could not speak Hebrew or could not speak Aramaic. So they needed a Bible that they could understand. So it had to get translated into Greek. And it's the Greek translation that underlies most of the New Testament. Everybody with me on this so far? This is why Jews and Christians sometimes have a problem, because Christians are reading through the Greek and Jews today are all reading through the Hebrew. This is why Christians have a virginal conception in Isaiah and Jews don't, but that's another story. In the book of Judges, Jephthah the judge sends his messengers to the Ammonites. Usually, by the way, what to me and to you is among enemies. The Ammonites are the enemies. What to you and to me that you have come to me to fight against my land? Second Chronicles, another relationship of war. The widow of Zarephath, and you know her from Luke chapter 2. There were many widows in the land of Israel, but Elijah only went to the widow of Zarephath. That's Jesus' sermon in Luke chapter 4. The widow of Zarephath says to Elijah, "What between me and you, man of God, you have come to me to cause sin to be remembered and cause my son to die." Whoa! What to me and to you? Okay, it's rude. And for all those commentators that say, oh no, sons referred to their mothers as women back then, no, they didn't. But what happens in the Gospel of John is Jesus frequently addresses women as woman. So to the Samaritan woman at the well, in Eastern Orthodox churches, she's called Fotini, the light bringer, by the way, which sends us back to John chapter 1. The Samaritan woman at the well, by the way, is the world's first successful evangelist. She gets there before the guys do, right? Jesus refers to her as woman. He will call his mother again at the cross woman, as in woman, behold your son. When he meets Mary Magdalene at the tomb, he says to her, woman, why are you weeping? So there are some more sexist people who say Jesus can't recognize one woman from another. They all look alike. You know, in the pictures, they're all wearing blue veils, whatever. No. He calls them women because he doesn't know their names. No. Besides which, everybody's called Mary, so it's a good bet. Why? What I want to see him do, and this is my imagination because I don't know, I want that word woman to echo all the way through the text, as it does from chapter 2 to chapter 20, to point out that there are women in this movement, and if it were not for the women in the movement never would have gotten off the ground. So as the church, as we move toward the 2nd century, the 3rd century, and John's probably written toward the end of the 1st century, the beginning of the 2nd, when women's rights are being constrained, I want to hear that echo, woman, 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 all the way through to say that we are there. I can't prove that that's what's going on, but I think that's what's going on. I think that's helpful. Third day. We know this is happening on the 3rd day. Here's a little bit more timekeeping. In John chapter 2, verse 4, we're getting there. What to me and to you, woman, my hour has not yet come. Not clear, right? Well, we've gone from the 3rd day to the hour, and John says, pay attention again to timing. To the Samaritan woman, he says, the hour is coming and is now. And this is typical of John. It's now and it's coming. It's not yet, but it's already. It's here and there's more to come. As if John is saying, you don't have to wait for Jesus to come back. All that stuff about salvation and life abundant, you've got it here now. It's already present. So in the Gospel of John, salvation is the encounter with Jesus. It's that born anew moment. It's moving into the new family. It's already celebrating. It's coming. There's something more in the future. But you've got it all here. It's all now. The hour is coming and is now when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. The hour is coming. This is chapter 5. Chapter 5 is the story about that cranky guy who can't get into the pool. I don't like this man, by the way. The hour is coming and is now when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live, as if the dead are already part of the system. And in chapter 7, Jesus escapes arrest because his hour has not yet come. There are 2 words for time in Greek. One is chronos time. That's chronology. It's clock time. Like, what time is it? And you look at your watch. But there's another word for time called kairos. Kairos time. Kairos is the opportune time, the special time, the time when something changes. Like, people remember kairos moments. Like, remember probably, if you've been married, the year that you got married, the year that you graduated from high school, right? Your 25th anniversary. You remember those years, right? The year you turned 60, some of you, right? The year that you turned 18. And then there's like the time you turned 24, like nobody cares. And what Jesus wants to do, what John wants to do, is in the same way heighten our sense of taste so that any glass of water, cup, even church coffee, but you have to extend. Anytime you feel a breeze, anytime you think of time, time has now become sacred. The hour is now and is coming. So if somebody says, what time is it? And we automatically look at our watches. Think about the time of God. Think about every moment as being sacred. So John wants to change not only our senses of sense, taste, smell, hearing, sight, but even our sense of time. It's also the hour of bold speech. The hour is coming when I will no longer speak to you in figures, but I will report to you with freedom of speech, parrhesia, boldly about the Father. So if you read the Gospel of John, the hour has come when you've seen all that bold preaching. And you can get alternative examples of this in the Gospel of Mark, where Jesus in the first part of Mark keeps talking in parables, and even the disciples have no clue what he's talking about. But finally, Jesus says something boldly. He spoke the word logos, same word in the Gospel of John, boldly. And what does he say that's boldly and clear? It is necessary for the Son of Humanity to undergo much suffering. Boldness of speech is related to the cross. It's related to clarity. And when you get to the end of the Gospel of John, the hour is there and it's perfectly clear. For ours, it's also the hour of persecution. An hour is coming when all who kill you will suppose they are offering worship to God. And that's what happened to some of the early Christian martyrs. So to be in the system is not only to be at a wedding, to be in the system is also to be a witness. That sends us back to the gospel, right? John the Baptist is the witness. But what Jesus wants his followers also to do is to be a witness, to proclaim boldly, because at any minute, at any hour, your faith may be tested. Will you know what to say? By the way, we're still at a wedding. We're in John chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 5. His mother said to the servants, the word for servants in Greek is diakonoi. It's where we get deacon. Do what he tells you to do. The mom is fabulous. Jesus says to her, what to me and to you, woman, my hour is not yet come. And I can picture the mom going. And then she goes over to the servant, do whatever he tells you. She knows her kid. She knows exactly what he will do. She doesn't have to say, listen, sweetie. You know, it's not the way you talk to your mom. She says, I get it. You're Jesus. You're doing your hour thing. But it's perfectly clear to me because the hour has not yet come, but the hour also is now. It's a both and she gets it. So even though Jesus looks like he's saying no, he's really saying yes, which is typical for what happens in prayer. You know, are you getting an answer? What to me and to you? Your hour's fine. God will take care of it. I will take care of it. Deacon is an important term. It shows up in Romans chapter 16, verse 1, where Paul identifies a woman named Phoebe as a deacon. And he actually uses the masculine term here, diakonos. There is a feminine form of deacon. And she's probably the one who not only brought the epistle to the Romans from Cenchreae, that's the port of Corinth. She's probably the one who read it to the church. So we have a woman in Paul being identified as a deacon. In Philippians, another letter of Paul talks about deacons and bishops. The word for bishop, by the way, is episkopoi. It really means overseers. I think you can anagram it to Episcopalians. I think you can. Presbyterai, I think you can get Britney Spears. 1 Timothy chapter 3 provides qualifications for the office of deacons. So John chapter 2, where we have a reference to deacons, what do? They serve others. They listen to Jesus. They listen to the woman. They listen to Jesus' mother. And these deacons, by the way, the servants, probably both men and women, because both men and women worked in the service industry. So when you have a Greek masculine plural, there may be women there. The deacons probably male and female. John also uses the word diakoneo, that's the verbal form, to deacon, to serve. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, there will be my servants also. Whoever serves me, the Father will honor. So when I hear deacon language later in the Gospels, I can think back to the people who were part of the catering staff. But the catering staff at the wedding is also the deacons who serve the church. So if you've ever been in the service industry, like if you worked as a waiter or a waitress, that's your role. But it's also to serve the church in a very wonderful way. There's a difference, by the way, between being a diakonos and being a doulos. A deacon is a servant, a doulos is a slave. a slave. There were no enslaved people mentioned at this wedding, which I think is staggering, because back then, particularly in Greek society, who would be working weddings? Enslaved people, but not here, they're servants. And John lets us know that there are enslaved people because we get an example of one in John chapter 4, and another example of an enslaved person who was named called Malchus, and he shows up in John 18. He's the guy who gets his ear chopped off in the garden. There were standing there 6 stone water jars for purification. Greek is actually washings of the Jews, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. So what's going on here? A number of commentators, this drives me up the wall. A number of commentators state that by turning water into wine, Jesus is replacing or eliminating Jewish practices. Has anybody heard that? Okay, it's a fairly common sermon motif. Wrong. They've already washed. That's why the jars are empty. The wedding is on full swing. Everybody's washed beforehand. But why stone jars? Well, stone does not mean like granite. It means chalk stone. And these are chalk stone vessels. These are actually first century vessels. Israeli archaeology is pretty good here. Why chalk stone vessels? Chalk stone vessels, as opposed to ceramic, right? Ceramic would be clay vessels. Ceramic vessels can become impure because stuff can soak into the ceramic. Chalk stone vessels are impervious to impurity issues. And that's why we begin to see more and more chalk stone vessels archaeologically in the land of Israel in the 1st century. Why? Probably because the Romans came in at the middle of the 1st century BCE. And what happens when you're colonized, and this happens to every group, it's cross-cultural. When you're colonized, you take traditions that mark you as distinct from your colonizer. Romans love ceramics. The Jews are starting to an uptick of chalk stone vessels, just to show we're not Romans. In terms of washing before they eat, right? Orthodox and conservative Jews do this to this day. So if you go over to West End Synagogue, which is your neighbor, and you're there on a Friday night or a Saturday before the service, there will be washing stations. And not all Jews will do this. In the Orthodox synagogue where I go, which is Shereth, Israel, the closer you are to downtown, the more Orthodox you are. That's how you do Jewish geography. We have a service, and before and after the service, there's a meal, right, on the Sabbath. We will ritually wash our hands. So we take our jewelry off, and there are these pitchers that have 2 handles, and you put water on your hands, and you go 3 times, and there's a blessing. If you remember the Gospel of Mark chapter 7, the Pharisees and all the Jews wash their hands before they eat. Remember this one? And the disciples don't do that, which is a little weird. So why are they doing this? Because the book of Exodus chapter 19 says we're all supposed to be a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. This verse is picked up, by the way, in the first epistle to Peter. Well, priests in the temple would wash their hands before they touched the elements. So the Pharisees, who were kind of egalitarian, say, why should only the priest do that? In Judaism, priesthood is inherited. If your father's a priest, you're a priest. So the Pharisees, who were egalitarian, say, we don't really care who your dad was. Anybody can wash hands before you eat, and there's plenty of water. This is Galilee. So we could all be like priests, and our dinner table, they didn't have tables, by the way. Our dinner table becomes like the altar in the temple. And that's why we wash before we eat. There are some churches, this may sound familiar to you, that before communion is served or Eucharist is served, the person who's serving will ritually wash hands. Does that sound vaguely familiar? It should. It's not for hygiene. If it were for hygiene, you'd be using Purell. Okay. But there's usually a little cup of water, and who's that? That's that old ritual. That's what Pharisees were doing. So that's why you have these rites of purification. Here are the chalkstone limestone vessels. They're less likely to break, by the way. And this is part of this resistance of colonialism, like coins without pictures of people on them, Sabbath lamps that can go for 25 hours, ritual bathing pools, mikvaot. This is what Jews are doing back then. So chalkstone vessels, sure, 30 gallons. Now, I'm not really good with measurements, and math is not my strong suit. So I figured, what does this equal to? How much wine are they serving? A keg of beer is a little over 15 gallons. Each chalkstone vessel is the equivalent of 2 kegs of beer. So Jesus provides about 12 kegs, or if you prefer, 216,000 venti-sized coffees. I mean, this is a big party. These are huge chalkstone vessels. This is just a little cup. He says, fill the jars with water. The party's in full swing. The guests have already washed. Water. like at the beginning of creation when God divided the waters above from the waters below. I'm back to Genesis. Or in chapter 4, give me to drink. The well is deep. You will have water flowing up. It's all this water imagery. So for John, the connotation of water has changed, including living water in chapter. They filled him up to the brim. Obedience to Jesus, obedience to a mom. And the diakoni do not question, why do this? And he says to them, now draw some out and bring it to the catering manager. Okay, the English translations don't say catering manager. They usually say chief steward, but I've never been to a wedding where there's been a chief steward, but I've been to a lot where there's a catering manager. So that's what this guy is. You know, I don't know what the service, I don't know when the water got changed. I don't know how it got changed. In effect, we have to draw our own conclusions. So it changes. We do not exactly know when, and we don't know who knows what. And when the catering manager tasted the water that had become wine, what? The water that had become wine? He didn't know where it came from, but the servants who drew the water knew. I love this. Staff knows stuff that employers don't. For anybody who's ever worked for a manager, this is a really good passage. Like those people in the back office, they don't know. We know. But it's also that sense of taste, that sense of smell, the mystery that the servers, the diaconoi, the deacons know. The catering manager calls the bridegroom. But now I've got all that bridegroom stuff again because Jesus is a bridegroom. Does he call Jesus? I don't think so. Where's the bride? Now, is this a miracle? So if you look up changing water into wine on the internet, because I did, because I'm a good biblical scholar, you can find an internet site that's called Magic Merlot, and you can actually do this. You can turn water into wine, and they tell you how to do it. I practiced this. It works. It's a little messy because I spilled a little bit, but it actually works. So some people have attempted to explain this is not, it's just a magic trick. Not when you're dealing with gallons of stuff. Magic Merlot doesn't work. So for people who want to say it's a magic trick, I mean, you can do this, but this is the first of the signs. So what happens? The catering manager says, all people put first out the good wine, and when the guests have become drunk, they put out the plonk. We don't have any evidence of people in antiquity doing this, by the way. I think this is quite tacky, right? Let them all get drunk, and then you can put out, the gallo or the stuff that only costs $3 a bottle. So people didn't do this back then. I mean, that's not how people drink wine, by the way. You start from lighter stuff to heavier stuff. So I don't know what this catering manager is thinking, but I think maybe if that's the way he ran things, he could probably get a discount. Is everybody at the party drunk? The whole thing is just now very peculiar. But what's going on here, just to finish up, what we have here is an anticipation of the heavenly banquet. People back then would have known Isaiah. And Isaiah chapter 25, verse 6 talks about the Lord of hosts will make a feast for people of rich food, of well-aged wines, of well-aged wine strained clear. This is the best wine. So when you taste that best wine at the wedding of Cana, that's that the hour is coming and is now. It's already there at that wedding. And if you look at Isaiah 25, by the way, and I would encourage you to do that, well, Isaiah 25 goes on to talk about how God will swallow up death forever. Your dead will live, corpses will rise. So once you've got that connection to that feast of well-aged wines, you read the rest of Isaiah 25, and that circles back to the Gospel of John. Everybody with me on that? There's also competition here. This is Bacchus. By the way, if you saw the French Olympics with that scene that was supposed to be a parody of the Last Supper, it wasn't. It was actually Dionysius. Dionysius is the god of wine. Dionysius dies and rises again. Dionysius has women followers. And John knows that. And John's readers know that. So what's John doing? John is saying, you might have heard of Dionysius. Our God is bigger and better and has better wine and is worth following. John knows the pagan stuff, and John brings the pagan stuff in. Calling the bridegroom, could it be Jesus? We don't know. Jesus did this, the first of his signs. Greek terms say Maya, same word as semiotics in Cana. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. This is where chapter 2 stops, or at least where our scene stops. And this is where I have to stop because it's 10:46. But where are we? It's the first sign. This John tells us there are going to be other signs. Go look for them. They're there. There will be 7. What do they believe? He can turn water into wine. Good for him. What else are they believing? Can they go back to Isaiah? Do they understand the hour? Why Cana in Galilee? Because he's going to go back and forth from Galilee to Judea. Do signs create faith, or is faith required for the sign to be recognized? And John says it's a both and. When you read John 2, and I hope you will read it again, it will send you back to the beginning and it will send you forward. And when you read through the end of the gospel with images of water and wine and deacons and serving and people called women and the hour that is coming but is not yet but is, all of it will circle back. And each time you do it, you will become richer and richer and richer. It makes me actually a little bit tipsy. Yeah. And it makes me thirsty because it wants me to taste more. Comments or questions from you? And if you have to leave, I understand. You're all okay? It's fabulous, fabulous stuff. And you can do this with every single chapter in the Gospel of John. So if additional questions occur to you, send me an email, or better, invite me back. And the next time, thank you. But seriously, the next time you feel thirsty, or you take a sip of coffee, or for me, Diet Pepsi, or whatever it is that works for you, or you feel a breeze, or you see light, or you hear a voice, it's all the Gospel of John. And anytime anybody says to you, what time is it? Move from Chronos time to Kairos time, because every moment for the Gospel of John is imbued with the Spirit of God. And I'm Jewish, and I can't think of a better message than that. Thanks very much.